here's what we're going to talk about, the main event. We're referring to the Web of Webforms. It's, as I said before, it's one of the most highly requested topics that you've asked for. And we're here to talk about some of the new features that you may be able to use to improve web forms. We're going to talk about tips for optimizing the forms and best practices and how to avoid security problems, which are real. Now, I do want to warn you that this is an advanced overview. There's no way that you're going to be able to take all the information you're going to hear today and suddenly start building your web forms without having had some prior experience with the building of web forms. But not to worry. I want to point out that this is going to be an in-depth presentation, but that it's going to lead to the creation of some workshops, so that if we do whet your appetite today and you are interested in building more advanced web forms, we will be offering workshops to help get you going. So take some notes. If you have questions, we're going to try to answer a few of them at the end of this presentation. But keep in mind that if you do have really interesting questions that don't get answered today, there are other opportunities. Not only the workshops that we're talking about, but keep in mind that there's also a drop-in lab that is run by the ICS trainers. And so, we're going to get right into it. Get your mobile phones ready, there will be a quiz. Leanne?
Thank you, Carl, for that rousing introduction. Now, just gonna have a fair bit of business here. Now, if that hasn't gotten you into the spirit of today's presentation, I'm hoping our title card will. So, so I didn't just put that there to satisfy my inner fangirl. I just want to let you know that the ponies are going to be our spirit guides, so to speak, through the world of web forms today. And yeah, so if you're a My Little Pony fan, this is definitely your day. Now, first off, I'd like to thank everyone who responded to our web form survey. And here are the results by order of your preference. So the first one is formatting your web forms, followed by conditionals, then Webform Security, then submissions and other settings, and finally, wizards with web forms. Like ponies, web forms are very powerful, and as you can see from this list of topics, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so we have to keep things moving at a gallop. So we're just going to mix things up a little bit so that each topic nicely segues into the next. Now, as Carla mentioned, if you have minimal experience with web forms, I can't promise that you're going to be an expert at the end of this presentation, but hopefully you'll get a taste of what is possible, and then afterwards, you can let us know what topics you'd like to have more in-depth information on. So we're off. So first off is formatting your web forms. Now, there are actually 3 components that can help you make your web forms smaller, sleeker, and more attractive to users. And the first one is the matrix. Now, the matrix lets you display multiple components in columns. I don't know if you can see my cursor here. Yeah, so these are the columns. And these subcomponents can include text fields, select options, labels, dates, and text areas. Now, what you see here on the right is an example of a form that can be used to create a catalog of My Little Pony collectibles. So you have 3 columns for character name, as you can see here, condition of the collectible, followed by the number. Now, on the 4th column, you also have options to remove a row. And finally, at the bottom, another button that says, but I have more ponies. So this is just in case you have more than 6 and you just want to keep on adding to your collection. So this is what the admin for the matrix component looks like. So it doesn't look like much of your usual components because the first thing that you actually see are options for adding the rows and columns. And the thing to pay attention to here is the column setting, because the columns determine the number of elements or subcomponents that will appear in your matrix. So from what you can see here, you have element 1, or the first subcomponent, which is a select option for the character, followed by another select option for the condition, and then finally, a text field for the number. Now, as you can see, depending on the kind of subcomponent or element you're using, you're going to get different sets of fields. You can also see, if you scroll down that admin screen, you can also see options for buttons that would enable users to add new rows and delete rows as well. So because the matrix has its own built-in set of components, subcomponents, sometimes it can be difficult to modify. For instance, you can't always change the order successfully, and they don't always work as well as they should. And it can be sometimes glitchy with the date component and the add row and remove row functions. And it's interesting because all of these components are actually just a single component. So the submission data that's contained in the web form, if you download it, you'll see that it's actually all contained in a single cell. So if you can see here, so you've got the different characters listed here, Twilight Sparkle, Applejack, but they're all displayed in a single row. So that means that it's going to be very difficult to parse that data, and you can't probably use that in your subcomponents, or you can't reference them in your emails or your conditionals. So I'm not saying don't use it, but definitely be aware that you should use it with some caution and an awareness of its limitations. So the next up, we're going to talk about the advanced grid. Now, chances are if you've used a grid in your web form, you probably used it to create a survey, kind of like the web form presentation topics survey that some of you have responded to. Now, but what you may not be aware is that you could use the grid component to display other components in rows. So, and it works with any component too, and what it basically does is display any common options as column headings, what you see here at the top, and any field labels are going to be displayed in the first column. So that's super useful because you can basically combine different fields with the same options. So here's an example of a form that lets you customize your own My Little Pony by letting you choose different colors for the mane, the tail, body, and eyes. So the mane and tail are represented here at the top as a grid component, while the body and eyes are two different select options. So all of these fields have the same color options, as you can see: white, yellow, light blue, fuchsia, and purple. And now the only difference is that for the eyes, you've only got 3 options. You don't have white or yellow because basically if you specify that for your pony's eyes, your pony's gonna look like a zombie. So we don't want that. And if you go into the admin, this is what it's gonna look like. So as I mentioned, a grid followed by 2 select options. But what if you start nesting the select options under that grid? All right, so basically you're just gonna drag it underneath. And this is what your form is gonna look like. Ta-da! So all the components are now neatly displayed in rows, and the options appear in columns with the radio buttons displayed accordingly. Where there are no options that are applicable, such as white and yellow for the eyes, the radio buttons just don't appear. So I think that's pretty sweet. So just to show you again what it looks like with or without advanced grid, here's a comparison, right? Now, because you can nest any component into a grid, you can also use it to format complex forms into a single table. So no more excessive scrolling for you users. So here's a closer look at the entire form. You can see all kinds of components, not just select options, but markup, text fields, email, and even field sets. And here's what it looks like in the admin. So you can see at the top, there's the grid. and all the other components are just sitting right underneath it. So you can use grids to create compact, better aligned forms because, as I said, they work with any component, but maybe not page breaks. You're certainly welcome to try. I know I haven't, but you can let me know how that turns out. The other thing is that the information from these components can still be referenced when you set up your emails and conditionals, and all the data is displayed correctly in Excel. However, keep in mind that any hidden fields, if you choose to use a hidden field in your advanced grid, that's okay, but just note that they're still going to be displayed as empty rows. So what you're actually seeing here, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Okay, at the bottom, that's not actually padding. That's actually a hidden component, so it's still displaying a bit. The other thing that you need to watch out for is because it's displayed as a table, it basically retains its width. And it doesn't matter if you have other components on that page, whether you have a vertical menu or a sidebar. So if you're going to use this, make sure that your grid stands alone. There's no other elements on the page, just so there's no overlapping occurring. Now, finally, select options and columns. Now, if you've been working with Webforms relatively recently, you would have noticed by now that if you don't set your select options to display as a list box, they are going to be displayed as adaptive columns. And this works for checkboxes, radio buttons, and even limited select options. Now, this is a really cool way of breaking up long forms by adding visual interest. And you don't even need to think about it because it's adaptive, which means that the number of columns changes depending on whether you have menus or sidebars or not. So the first example here at the top, you're getting 3 columns because there's no other elements on the page, and then followed by an example, 2 columns, because you have a vertical menu on the side, and then finally an example of a 1-column set of select options because you have both the vertical menu and the sidebar block. So it works really well. It even works with grids and field sets, but not so much with long labels because, well, anyway, you should avoid using long labels with your select options anyway. So finally, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Joyce Peralta for our first poll. So take it away, Joyce.
Okay, thanks, Leanne. So we thought we'd add these polls in this part of the presentation to break it up because, as Carl and Leanne have mentioned, there's a lot of information to absorb, and we want to make sure that you're picking it up. So we're going to do a poll. If you haven't used the polling software before, this is the software that's used in the classrooms when the lecturers do a poll. So you go to McGill.ca on your mobile device, McGill.ca/polling. And if you haven't yet registered, you'll need to register an ID or register an account in order to be able to participate, but hopefully you've participated already or you've registered already. So go to mcgill.ca/polling. The session ID is pro tips. And we're going to open the polling now for people to participate. The first question is a toughie, so I'll put our thinking caps on. Which component is affected by the presence of vertical menus and sidebar blocks? Is it A, the matrix, B, the advanced grid, C, select options, or D, pony saddles? So enter your answers in and give you a few seconds. Okay, we'll close the polling in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and see how you did. All right. So 18% said the matrix, 46% said the advanced grid, 28% said the select options, and 8% said pony saddles. There's some jokers in the audience. So the answer is actually advanced grid. So good work to those people that answered correctly. I'm going to turn it back over to Leanne right now to continue on. We're about a third of the way through the presentation. Thanks, Leanne.
Okay, so actually, while an advanced grid actually is a table, so it's actually just going to stay the same width no matter what you do. So that's why we would advise that you don't place it on a page that has vertical menus and sidebar blocks. So what responds to the presence of vertical menus and sidebar blocks is the select options, just so you know. Right. All right, now we're going to take a little side trip to the 1990s with Wizards with Webforms. Now, it's actually a bit surprising because when we did the Webform survey, we found out that it was the least popular of our topics and that most folks really aren't aware, I believe, that wizards can be used to do a lot of things, like simplify complex tasks, direct users to content, and even create short, fun quizzes like the one I'm going to show you today. Now, here's an example of a very short "which character are you" type quiz that helps people find and connect with their inner pony. So let's get started. So who's your pony? The first question is, what kind of pony are you? Are you Earth pony? Are you Pegasus pony? Or are you a unicorn? So for today's example, let's say we selected Pegasus, and then let's click on the next button. So we're presented with the second set of questions. So having chosen Pegasus pony, what Pegasus pony qualities do you possess? Are you loyal, competitive, or brash? Or are you nervous, shy, and empathetic? So let's choose loyal, competitive, and brash. Click on the next button, and voila. You're Rainbow Dash, and she is so fierce, and I know that a lot of you are going to relate to her. All right, just drink it in, just absorb that. So, but what if instead of like finding and connecting with your own inner pony, what your visitors really need to do is be guided through a complex multi-step process, maybe like figuring out a piece of complex software, or what if they need to find content on a large site with multiple levels of navigation, and you've got audience-specific sections that you actually can direct them to from your main menu at the top. So there is a solution for that, fortunately. So this can all be done just by asking your users to answer a series of questions, marking their progress, and showing results based on their answers. In other words, by building a wizard. Now, if you break it down, really, a wizard is just a form with questions, next and previous buttons, a progress bar, and results. So you've got the progress bar there, you've got the question here, and you've got the next and previous buttons. Now, going into the admin, you'll see that the questions are provided by select options here and here, and the sections are created by using page breaks, which are here, and the results are displayed by using the markup. Now, the markup was responsible for showing that bit of text and that image of Rainbow Dash at the end of our wizard. Now, one thing you might notice, just looking at this admin, is that there's a heck of a lot more going on here than what you actually experienced on the actual form. I mean, where are all the other questions, and where are all the other kinds of ponies? I mean, where's Applejack, where's Rarity, where are all these guys, you know? But how come we didn't see all these other results? Okay, so one answer. Because conditionals. Now, in a wizard, the answers to the different questions are evaluated with the use of conditionals. And what you see, if you can, as you realize that I've highlighted here, is the actual decision stream that we took that led to the result of Rainbow Dash. Now, if your users chose a different decision stream, then definitely it will lead to a different result. So, because you know that we're going to have a poll, we're going to have a quiz, so I'm just going to help you along by reviewing a few things. So, a wizard is typically an anonymous web form with questions that are provided by select options, and the answers to these questions are evaluated by conditionals. Now, there are next and previous buttons, which lead to different sections or steps which are created using page breaks. And you also have a progress bar where progress can be indicated by page numbers, page labels, or percentage completed. And of course, you also have results. And the results are provided using the markup component. Now that you know what you can accomplish using a wizard, you might actually want to try and go out and start building them. But before you do, you should remember that it's probably best to keep your wizards anonymous, okay? Because later on in this presentation, we're going to be urging you guys to authenticate your forms. We're going to stress that repeatedly. But in this case, we're going to say it's okay to keep your wizards anonymous because you're just going to be asking, you're not going to be asking your users to provide confidential details. You're just going to be asking them to answer simple questions, which brings us to our second point. Use simple questions. Now, another thing you need to realize when you're building your wizard is that confirmation pages really aren't that useful. So this is an option that you can uncheck later in your form settings. And because you no longer have a confirmation page, but you still have a submit button. So that's not really going to be useful. So another thing that you might want to do is you want to modify your submit button and change the text to something like reset or start over. So it just makes it look like your wizard is going to reset itself. Now, we're going to segue now into conditionals. Now, having looked at wizards, you probably have some idea now of how conditionals work and how they're basically used to hide or show components based on the value of other components. But now that we know what a conditional can do, as we've amply shown, let's try and find out how it does it. So let's start by breaking it down into two main parts. The if statement, which for our purposes here today, we're going to call the condition. And the second part, the then statement, which we're going to call the consequence. Now, mind you, like I said, these are not official or technical terms. They're just going to roll off the tongue better than saying if statements and then statements repeatedly as we describe what's happening. Now, there's a wide variety of combinations of conditions and consequences possible. They can go anywhere from very simple conditional statements like if X, then A. Can't get any simpler than that, to conditional statements that are a lot more complex. So building on if X then A, slightly more complex, you've got if X or Y, then B. And then you've also got if X and Y, then C. Now, what you see here, the or and the and, or they're what we call operators. Now, an interesting thing that I'd like to show you about the second example is that it actually has what we call a nested condition. And you can create a nested condition by clicking here on this plus button that's between parentheses. And these nested conditions actually come into their own once you start to get more and more, think of more and more complex conditional statements. Now, here's one such example. Now, in the first one, you can see here a nested condition with an AND operator followed by a single consequence. So you actually have 1, 2, 3 conditions there. And another example is the second one here. If X and Z, then A, then B. So you have 2 conditions here, 1, 2, followed by 2 consequences. Now, what I've shown you here today, I could go on and on about all the different kinds of conditional statements that are possible, and there is such a huge variety, and we won't be able to discuss them all here today. But I just wanted to show you what was possible, and I want to let you know that really the kind of conditional statements that you make ultimately depend on the complexity of your form and the possible outcomes that you want to present to your users. And really, the only way to really learn conditionals is to just go out there and start building your own web forms. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. We all make them. But you need to be able to put yourself in the right frame of mind. This works for conditionals. This works in general, for doing anything when you're building a web form. So, because it's just so easy to get lost in the minutia of web form administration, I would suggest really that you take a step or two back and just think about it in different terms. So one way to do that is to start thinking of your form as a river. It meanders along slowly but surely, flowing in one direction. Now, what you're going to see is the first fork in your river. And this is actually the first question. Now, the first question is the point at which the river begins to fork into different streams. You can see that there are 3 streams here. Now, the number of streams actually depends on how many options are possible. So, previously we had 3 options, Earth, Pegasus, and Unicorn, so we have 3 streams. And the streams themselves will fork into smaller streams, once again depending on how many options there are, and so on and so forth, until finally the user reaches a result. And like I said, you probably guessed that this is our previous wizard in Pony River form. And I would like to emphasize one thing. It flows in one direction, and notice that only one stream leads to a particular outcome. Please bear that in mind when you're using conditionals. So here's what the form looks like again in the admin view when you click on the Conditionals tab. Now, I showed you that Pony River, not just because of some weird inner fangirl fixation, but what I really want you to do is to absorb the idea that you need to plan your forms beforehand. You need to figure out where all the forks and all the possible outcomes in your form are going to be coming from. So to do that, you don't need any fancy flowcharting software. You just need to draw out your decision streams as I showed you previously. And it helps even when you've already built your form and you're running into problems making your conditionals work. Just take a step or two back, draw it out on paper. I guarantee it's going to help. Now, the other thing, keep it simple. Actually, the less conditionals that you use, the better. It's better for form processing speed, and it's better for your user's experience. And also, if you have a lot of fields, another way to keep things simple is to use either field sets or even page breaks to group components. And this will enable you to separate fields that are not going to be affected by conditions. And you can also easily hide or show consequence fields that way. And finally, as I've repeated before, only one stream can lead to a particular outcome. This means that if you have 2 conditional statements that lead to the same consequence, you're going to get an error. Okay? So that's probably the most common error that people are going to encounter. Now, time for our pop quiz. So over to you, Joyce.
Okay, so back to mcgill.ca/polling for the next quiz. I don't know if you remember when Leanne went through the survey results at the beginning, the wizards were actually at the bottom. They were one of the least things that people wanted to find out about. And that kind of surprised us because it's something that we often get requests for when we work with people. One of the examples was the Skills 21 site. So they have a bunch of different workshops and they wanted to be able to take their potential participants through a questionnaire that allowed them to identify what their career goals were, what types of things they were interested in, and then at the end show them what workshops would work for them based on the responses that they gave. And I think there's a lot of applications, potential applications for that here at McGill. So just something to keep in mind. So this question's a little bit easier. So the question is, what is used to evaluate answers in wizards? And the 4 options are A, progress bar, B, conditionals, C, questions, and D, horns made of pure silver. So enter your answers in now. I'll try and get it right this time. And we will close the polling in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's see how we did. Great, okay. So 8% said progress bar, 83% said conditional, so everybody was listening that time around. Questions got a 6% answer, and 2% said horns made of pure silver. Thank you. Thanks, Leanne.
All right. Okay, I'm very glad to see that we're getting a lot of that everyone's paying attention, and we haven't lost too many people yet. So we're going to move on to submissions and other settings. Now, let's say you've planned your form, you've built it, now you're ready to release it into the wild like a beautiful pony. Just let it run free. So, but try to resist that temptation for a little while, and don't forget that there are still some settings that you would do best to verify before you let your web forms run free. Now, one thing that you should always try to do is verify if the right people are able to access your form. And one way to do that is to use submission access. So yes, you can check submission access settings to specify whether your form can be accessed by anonymous or authenticated users. And this is the part where we start saying it's always best to authenticate. Just save yourself the trouble. Just authenticate your forms. Now, but if you really, really have to have a form that's anonymous, just make sure that when you set your forms to anonymous, make sure that the authenticated user option is also checked. Because otherwise what's going to happen is that if you have other people who are already logged in, then the form is set to anonymous. It's actually going to force them to log out before they can access the form. So another thing that you should be aware of is that you can actually specify how many submissions are possible for your form, both for the form in general as well as per user. So, for instance, the form that you filled out to attend today's session actually has a limit of 150 because that's how many chairs we have today. And just be aware, there's also another way to manage submissions, and that's by using the limited select option component. Now, I'm not sure if many people use that. We've certainly used that in the convocation site. And that was actually developed for them. I'm not going to go into it too much, but there's a KB article about it, and it's pretty awesome, so I suggest that you check it out. What it basically does is that it's just the regular select options, but it lets you specify how many times a user can make a specific choice. Now, another thing that you can set is the per user submission limit. And this comes really into play once you start working with anonymous web forms. So more on that later. So, moving on to your email settings. Well, most of us, myself included, will have probably left your email template as shown here at the top, with all of the submission values included. Now, if you see this token right there, it says submission values. That's basically what this token does. This means that all of the data from all of the components that are checked under the included email values will be included. Now, because we're going to tell you that you should avoid transmitting confidential information from your submissions via email, you can do two things to guard against that. The first thing is to just remove this token that you see over here, and then just use individual submission tokens. And you can find out what tokens you can use by going to this link here, Browse Available Tokens. Another way, possibly a simpler way of doing that, is unchecking this option that says include all components. Okay, if you uncheck that and you start also unchecking all the components that would probably contain confidential information from your users, then that should make you set. Now, I don't know if most of you realize that it's also possible to specify different email submission recipients based on how users respond to questions on your form. In this example, as you can see here on the right, someone who answered the question, "What kind of pony are you?" And if they answered Earth Pony, their submission would be sent to earth.pony@mylittlepony.com. If they answered Pegasus, they would be sent to Pegasus .pony@milopony.com, and so on and so forth. Now, this just means that you can use component values to specify your email settings, and that a unique email address can be assigned per option or key value pair. Now, if you are going to use this feature, I would really suggest that if you have to modify your component, the component that you're using to reference your emails with, please do make sure, please double check your email settings afterwards, because it's possible that the email addresses might be lost. And that depends on what kind of, what changes you're going to make to your component. Another thing is that if you have a lot of options, if you have key value pairs that are like just like that, it's always best to list them alphabetically. It's just better to manage them that way. And one way to do that is just keep an Excel spreadsheet of it, and then just copy and paste those key value pairs into your select options settings. And now last, but certainly not the least, let's talk about Webform Security. Now, I mentioned anonymous forms earlier, and if you must absolutely use an anonymous web form on your site, please remember that you can still protect your form from spam by setting the per-user submission limit in the form settings. Now, be aware that there's already a measure in place that protects all of your web forms by blocking repeat submissions, limiting them to one submission per IP address per every 6 seconds. But if that's not secure enough for you, you can increase that limit to the options that you see right here. Another way, and this is very important, if you're going to have an anonymous web form, please do not use file upload fields. Okay, that just makes you so vulnerable. Anyone can upload anything onto your site, We have protections in place, but please don't give them that open door, and then spammers or bots are just going to walk right in. Another way to protect your form is to make sure that it is not possible for them to enter email addresses. And also, if you also provide other fields that it's possible for people to enter email addresses, what's going to happen is that if your form in particular is set to send a confirmation email to whatever email address is filled in there, well, that's just a recipe for lots and lots of spam. So, if you've been working with forms lately, and this does not just have to do with anonymous forms, but also with authenticated forms, you will have probably seen this notice here at the top with a link to the McGill policies regarding confidential information. Now, what it basically says, that link, is advising you that you should probably not collect credentials and confidential information on your email. And that's listed here as usernames, access codes, account numbers, passwords, PINs, tokens, or other authentication. Now, another thing, since we're saying don't send confidential information via email, this is the sort of stuff, all listed here, all the elements of a student's record are confidential. So that's the kind of information you shouldn't be passing around via email, not just through web forms, but in emails in general. Finally, no ifs and buts about it. The following details should never be collected via a web form. SIN numbers, credit card numbers, debit card numbers. Any forms containing these 3 fields are going to be so problematic. We want to let you know that if you require any kind of payment information from your users, then probably a web form is not the solution for you. It's always best to explore an e-commerce solution that is supported by McGill. And also, as he said, whenever possible, ask your users to sign in. And if you need to share submission information, please do not use email for this purpose. It's always better to ask anyone, any of your stakeholders who need to review submission information. Instead of sending them emails with that information, just ask for them to be granted access to your site. That way, they can just log in and view the submission information right on the form itself. It's just a lot much safer that way. Another thing that we'd like to say is that once you've created your forms, you do have to maintain them. You have to keep them up to date. And one thing that you probably need to do as best practice is to routinely download your web form submissions. That way, should anything happen to your form, you still got your submissions. You've still got your data from your users. And if you have, if your forms have served their purpose and you're done with them, please do unpublish or delete them because they're no longer needed, okay? And the other thing that you need to do is, if you have to update your forms, make changes to them, it's always good practice to close your form to submissions before you make any changes. That way, you avoid the possibility of a user filling out your form, and then all of a sudden their session is going to be cut short, and then they're going to lose all their information because you just happened to save right at the moment when they're entering information. So if you close your form to submissions, you are going to see a notice at the top that, of course, says close to submissions, right? But it's always a good idea to add some additional information there. And we always suggest that you add a temporary block explaining to your users when they should be able to expect your form to go back online, just to let them know that they haven't completely missed the boat. All right?